As I look over the room, I notice people from all different areas of the college. I see people who teach developmental subjects, all of the different ones that we offer. I see people from the support side of the college, from technology, administrators. I see people who take the students who are the first year freshman course people. They teach those courses that we send our developmental students to. And they say it takes a village to raise a child, and I think it takes a whole institution to successfully support a developmental student from admission to graduation. So I think it's wonderful that you're all here, and I think the diversity of this group from all those different areas of the college bodes very well for the future of our developmental students. I'd like to give a special welcome. We have 3 people here from Calvin College today. While they're from their Student Academic Support Unit, while their program is organizationally quite different from ours, their work is very, very similar. And they were very generous and hosted me and explained everything that they do and gave me lots of good ideas. And so we're really glad to have them with us today and to enrich our conversation. So welcome to you. And the next person I want to give a special welcome to is our acting provost, Dr. Don Boyer. I first met Don about 8 years ago maybe, when I began really working intensively with developmental education. And we're about to begin a 5-year program to improve our support services and just all of our services to developmental students. And that's been Don's vision, and he was tireless and tenacious, and he just did not give up. I don't know if anybody really realizes how much work Don has put into developmental education. And it's so fitting that he's here this morning as we're about to kick off the beginning of this 5-year plan. He's here, and it's really the culmination of his vision and dream. And even now, as our acting provost, he's making sure we have the resources to do the work that we have to do. He's been he's like the father of developmental education. So Don, let's see it.
More like a grandfather. I'd just like to say welcome to the group, and really to thank everyone for being here, especially the folks from Calvin. That's nice that you're willing to join us today. And for the faculty from GRCC, as she said, this is a passion that I have, and I'm really glad to see that this is really rolling well, and I'm glad to see the participation of our faculty. I guess if I had to put anything that I thought was the most important program on campus, it would be our program in academic foundations. It's probably the most important thing that we're doing. And to support that, I just wonder if people realize the numbers of students that we're dealing with. This year we had 1,230 students, new students that were in AFP. And that percentage of the new students, that's 24% of our new student enrollment. 24%. It's a huge part of our enrollment. And it's an important part that I just definitely have to be able to help. The students don't have the option any longer to say, well, gee, I didn't make it in college, so now I'm going to work at General Motors and make $30 an hour. Those jobs are gone. These people have to be trained. We have to get these people at a point where they can get the skills that they need to be successful. I don't know how many people listened to Mark Champion yesterday about looking into the future. If people don't have good math, reading, and learning skills, they're never going to survive in today's world. That's why this is so critical. That's 1,000 students that if we don't do something for them are going to be virtually out there. They'll be unemployed, underemployed. They're just not going to do the job, and they're going to be frustrated. And so this is so critical. And just again, thanks everyone. Thanks Cindy for all the work they do, and for Linda Swoman. They just have done a wonderful job. And of course the faculty too. Thanks.
I was going to introduce the people who are going to lead our breakout sessions in case you want to engage them in conversation during the break between the first session and the second, but only one is here. Carl, would you stand up? Dr. Carl Wagner is leading our breakout session in writing, and he's from Baker College. He's the Dean of Online Developmental Education for Baker College.
Linda, I've arrived.
Oh, Vicky's here. Thank you. Vicky's here. And we have Dr. Mickey Hay from Southwest Michigan College, and she'll be doing the counseling / PY 101 breakout. You want to stand up?
I'll stand. I'll sit.
Okay. We invited you here for basically we had two purposes in mind. One was so that you could deepen your conversation in your area, your subject area, your disciplines. So that's why we have the breakout sessions for you. But we also want to begin to develop our ability to talk across disciplines about developmental education. Because developmental educators are about more than their own disciplines. We help our students identify and use the tools that they need to construct knowledge. We all have a common metacognitive agenda that we are about. And that's not so easy to teach. And so I think we all need each other for support and for sharing ideas across our disciplines. And to help us in that conversation, we've invited Dr. Irene Durancic from the University of Minnesota. And Cindy will introduce her.
Thank you. Let me tell you just a little bit about Dr. Irene Durancic. She is actually from Detroit, Michigan. She's a Michigander. Spent her whole life in Michigan and worked at Eastern Michigan University until the University of Minnesota courted her and brought her along. She is a developmental mathematics educator. Her doctoral work was, interestingly, in evaluating developmental education programs, trying to decide what works. So that was her first research foray into developmental ed. The other research focuses that she's had since she's been working at University of Minnesota and earlier here in Michigan, she's looked at the effectiveness of developmental math programs. She's looked at socio-cultural pedagogy within the classroom. She's looked at affective factors affecting mathematics outcomes, the use of multicultural and constructivist materials to enhance learning, and interestingly, how ethno-mathematics research can inform developmental math research and practice. So those are some of her research areas. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and welcome Dr. Irene Durancic, and she will now give us our keynote address. Thanks.
Well, I am from Michigan, and the information that was sent out to you said I was one of 11 children. I'm from a family of 11, but there were only 9 children. So I only have 7 brothers. It's my pleasure to be back here in Michigan, and I started my college education at a junior college in Michigan, and my first post-secondary teaching was at a 2-year institution for about 8 years in Detroit, teaching developmental mathematics and administrating a campus. And so my background really is in developmental or in a community college level rather than the university, but they made an offer that I couldn't refuse, and I have always felt more comfortable in a community college setting. And actually, if I would think about it today, I still feel like an outsider in a large institution such as the University of Minnesota, because there's not many of me there. And part of the reason I went there is because I knew there weren't many people that came from a community college that are at the university, and they need to hear that voice also. The other thing I want to mention is, I did notice as I was looking through the web page that you have the Learning Corner at Wealthy, and actually that's where I really got started, even working in post-secondary education. I taught GED in a street academy in Detroit in the early 70s. And that's where I started seeing the disconnect between the school system. I was trained originally as a high school chemistry teacher. but I got pulled into this community organization and working in a street academy, and that's where I think the foundation of who I am today and my work in developmental education started. The other thing I wanted to mention is that that I want you to know that I don't think it's the role of a community college to do developmental education. I think it's the role of every institution to do developmental education. And if you've seen the latest issue of the Journal of Developmental Education, there's an article there talking about the roles and responsibilities, I think, that four-year institutions and universities have to bear with developmental education. The fact that you only have 25% or 26% of your students taking developmental education is really quite low. There are many, and there's a large number, almost 40% of people in post-secondary education end up taking one or more courses in developmental education. I think at Eastern it was almost 24% also that took developmental education courses. And developmental education has its roots in our egalitarian system of education in the United States. In Europe and in other places where universities started, there was a meritocratic system, and there was a system that left people out of aristocracy system in order to get into higher education. And part of what happened during the Jeffersonian times in the United States is that they opened the doors wider with the land-grant colleges and all the universities, so everybody had a right to that education. And we set up a more egalitarian system of education for participatory democracy. And not only because of employment, and although employment is one of is a very necessary part, but even greater than that need is the need in a participatory democracy that we have an educated citizenship. In the United States, the university system or the college system and developmental education started before high school started. And from there they saw that we actually needed preparation for high schools, and the high school system started in the United States. And I think the other thing, just kind of as a backdrop of what we need to remember too, is that the world is becoming more and more diverse. What we often have called the majority in the United States is really not the majority in our world, is not the majority on the planet. Our planet is more people of color, more people of poverty, more people who have not had all the rights and privileges of high school and college education. More of the kind of students that participate at a community college level are the kind of students that make up the world. And that's why part of my passion is to make sure that four-year institutions, universities, don't close the door to developmental education. Also, is if we're looking for a more world view, we need to have everybody in the mix having the conversation. And if we leave out developmental students at institutions beyond the two-year institutions, we're leaving out a very, very important voice. It's harder to transfer. We're taking people who are the most vulnerable in our system. We're saying you're not ready to go to a university or can't go to a university until you start here first. And then they have to go through that process of trying to find their identity, finding their place, finding a welcoming space in an institution twice. So we're taking people who may not feel like they have a right for an education or don't feel comfortable because it's not in their family tree that everybody went to college, and then we're giving them more hoops to go through and making them feel like an outsider longer than we really need to. So I know it's not your job alone, but I know we all have to work together to work at this issue. A lot of research has been done on what works in developmental education and what theories are most important. And so what I'd like to do today is kind of quickly, is this the one I have on? Yeah, because I have this one on too, but I switched screens. So I have already shared with you kind of my background and my lens, which certainly affects My research for my dissertation was in qualitative research, although I do some qualitative and some quantitative. And it's very important, and this is one of the points I want to hit the most when we talk about what we do as professionals in developmental education, is we need to understand our background, our lens, but we also need to listen to the student voice and the student's background and the student's lens and make that part of our classroom. And so that's why I shared that with you, trying to model the kind of thing that I know we need to be about. So then I want to talk a little bit, and I have a little bit about the field of developmental education, and then the major educational theories that are relevant to our practice today, and some guiding principles, and we'll be dealing with the next steps also as a group. This quote is actually quite long by Tinto and Goodselov, but it really, to me, sets the stage of how we need to think about developmental education and what our role is. And we're not trained in this kind of thinking in our disciplines, and we're not trained in this kind of thinking as administrators or as tutors or as administrative support staff. But we need to focus rather on the students, rather than focusing on students' behavior and obligations, we more carefully need to consider the character of our own obligations to construct educational settings in which students, all students, will become involved. We're always, not always, but we tend to think, what's wrong with the student? Why aren't the students doing well in my class? And the thought needs to be, what am I doing that needs to be done differently so the students do well in my class? What can I do to create a more welcoming environment? What can I do to spark people's curiosity and interest? We're born with curiosity and interest. You look at any child, they're anxious to learn. There's something that goes on through our education system that kills that in students. And we've seen students who, after 18, 20, 25 years, that a great part of that has been killed, and we have to revitalize that in students. And so it's not so much getting students ready for the academy, but getting the academy ready for students. And that's a different way of thinking about it. And it's elusive at times, because we're focusing more on the students rather than on what we're doing as an institution. And although he said this in '93, I think it's something that we still struggle with in institutions. And I just want to caution you also about research. And I know you know it more than the flagship universities know, but research also can lead us astray. This was just in the National Science Teachers Association's newsletter last week, and I saw that and I thought, well, this is great. This is really going to help us tremendously. I'm glad they did the research. But they took the research from the international study in math and science, and they looked at other countries and what's going on and how they get students to perform so well. And many of them aren't happy. They're in fairly rote systems, learning things on task year-round school. And they did better than us, so we need to make more miserable students so we can do well too. So I understand that research needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Developmental education, I'm sure many of you have seen this definition of developmental education. This is the definition that the National Association of Developmental Education talks about. And it says that theoretical foundations are on developmental psychology and learning theory. And basically that's where it has been with cognitive and affective growth for students. And I'll speak to that just a smidget, but I'd also like to take a look at a couple more areas that are more emergent theories that are being used within developmental education. And those are multicultural education, disability education, the sociocultural learning theory, and I'm not going to talk much about disciplinary learning theory because that's something that we all come with. We come with our training in our discipline. And that's been one of the most wonderful things that has happened to me since I moved to the University of Minnesota. I'm in a college at the university, or was in a college at the university, the General College, and it's an interdisciplinary college, and we're all developmental educators. But I'm not in the math department, I'm not in the writing department, I'm not in the reading department. We're a college that has science teachers, math teachers, language teachers, social science teachers, history teachers, humanities teachers. We've got the full gamut of teachers, and it's a group of about 35 faculty, and we meet regularly, twice a month, and share disciplinary learning theory. And what a rich resource that is. And that's the beauty, as I was thinking when Linda had mentioned the group that she was bringing together. That's probably the most valuable thing that you can do, is talk across disciplines. Since I've been at the University of Minnesota, I've taught math with a writing instructor as a learning community, and I learned a wealth of information about using the process that's used in our writing program, a more process approach, and then they have kind of internalize that. And how would you use a process approach in mathematics, so that we're moving from drafts of material, just like you do in writing. You never start off with a finished product. So why do we start with a finished product in math? It's either right or it's wrong. We could start out with a draft. We could have peer review. We could look at each other's work, how we're organizing things, and think about that, share it with one another, and then come up with a better draft. I've changed the writing on my test to be the first draft. I count the first draft, I critique it, students do a second draft. I'm interested that they learn the information before they exit the course. And so why can't we take that similar approach? And where did I get these ideas? It's certainly not from my disciplinary tower, but from this cross-sharing. In January, I'm teaching a course with a geology teacher, and we're going to take a similar approach. I'm teaching basically developmental mathematics, but with my eye on pre-calculus skills, and I'm going to do it within a context of geology to support students. Many of our students, and I don't know about your students, many of our students now are coming in with 2 or 3 years of high school math already completed, but still on their ACT are scoring very, very low. They've been introduced to everything, and if I introduce it to them the exact same way it was introduced to them the last 3 times, how am I supposed to expect that we're going to make progress? So I'm looking at new ways of doing it, and I hope this interdisciplinariness will also help you think about it in new ways. In student development, there are 2 major theorists that guide the thinking, and that is Chickering and his 7 vectors of how people develop. And I have just listed them. Developing competency, and that's individual competency, critical thinking, capacity to analyze. Even physical competency, particularly when we're talking about teenagers, and social interpersonal competency beyond their... It's the first time students are in a situation where they're more diverse. We're still quite homogeneous in our elementary and in our high school for most students. Some students from urban areas, of course, have much more exposure. Then learning how to manage emotions. And these things are certainly the areas that student development faculty go through and are trained in, but these are also things that need to be embedded in developmental curriculum. Developing autonomy, which is getting a little bit more difficult because of the helicopter parents, and you probably have less of them here. But it's a real struggle for students in developing autonomy if a parent is calling 4 times a day to see if they bought their books and if they had lunch. We sometimes have to let go. My son is now a junior in college, which is hard to believe, but he didn't even want a cell phone when he went to college. He didn't want it to, and I had permission to call him once a week, and we, through email, set up a time that I should call him. And other than that, he was establishing his identity. We have a wonderful relationship, but he also had that need to set up his own. Freeing interpersonal relationships. It's not who your parents want you to see, hang out with, and do it. The students are now on their own. developing purpose, and develop integrity. Oopsie. Go back one. And why are these things important? This needs to feed all of our disciplines, not just student development. We did a survey at the General College, and it was very clear that the math and science people didn't feel that any of these things were their responsibility. You could see that other disciplines had picked up on some of this and felt it was part of their responsibility. I know Linda is aware of the Map It program that we did that hits on some of these things, asking students, asking faculty about their role and whether or not this is happening within their college classroom or within their exposure at the General College. And it was very clear that some disciplines don't feel like this is their responsibility, but there are ways to infuse this kind of information into the disciplines, and hopefully that's what our conversations will be about. The individual students must be considered as a whole, and certainly this can also happen, and I'm going to kind of end up with some things that successful developmental programs do, and one of the things is a coordination of services, that the developmental faculty, the counselors, the tutors, the administrators, they get together on a regular basis to coordinate services so that they know what one hand is doing, that they're doing some things in sync together, maybe visiting an art institute together and having it come up in a few classes. Also professional development. This is a wonderful, if it is a first step, of pulling the various areas together for professional development. That is a way that this greater discussion on how to deal with the whole student can take place. And then in this last area here, recognizing that it is the student's job, but our job is to create the space for students to be able to do it. And we can't do that if we're always in charge, we're always controlling the conversation, if we're always guiding them in the direction that we think they need to be going, rather than listening and seeing where they are, being attentive in the moment with them, and seeing how we can get them from where they are to where they want to go, and with the tools that we have at our fingertips. And then Perry's cognitive theory is then the next one that, and if you want to write it down, go right ahead and write it down. I also have a copy of this on slides and on paper that I can leave, or I can email to people if you'd like it. And again, Perry's cognitive theory is also one of the great informants of what we've been doing in developmental education. And many students start off with dualism, and many math people like to keep them there. It's either right or it's wrong. But we can move beyond that. And I try to give students problems at the beginning of the semester that will kind of break that kind of barrier. Our campus is large, and yours is fairly large also, but I give them a math problem at the beginning of the semester in little small groups, giving them something to do on campus. I did this at Eastern also. If you had a half-hour break in between classes, would you be able to go to the bookstore and buy a book and still be on time for your next class? Well, there's a number of math kind of things in there. We've got the distance it takes to get to the bookstore. At the beginning of the semester, how long is that line? About how long does it take each person to get through the line? And you can come up with different answers, and it's going to depend on what your pace of walking is. It's going to depend on what time of the day is. So there could be innumerable right answers for that particular problem, depending on what you decide are the givens and what you think are the variables in that kind of situation. And I'm sure you can think of other situations that you can give students. And I try to deal with those that help me get students there on time, realizing what a break is and what kind of things can be accomplished in a break. I also usually give them a problem of going off campus to put a study group together. What kind of places could you go? What would be evenly spaced for people living in various parts of campus or off campus? And many of them, that's the first time they're off campus and actually look at places other than the Burger King, McDonald's, and look to see what other kind of resources are in the community. And so this is the process from dualism to relativism, and then many times students get stuck in that relativism, and we need to, again, keep on helping them through all our disciplinary work to get to a commitment. That things are, there is a lot of relativism, but it's also situated in your life, and with your commitments, your values, your goals, you can make some commitment and can move off in a direction even though there may not be one right way, one best thing to do. There may be one best thing for you to do. And so this is helpful also in establishing program goals and planning steps for implementation and evaluating effectiveness of our programs. How well are we embedding these ideas and concepts within our coursework? And again, this Map It tool that we've used is a wonderful tool to see where faculty are on this and where students are. The next theory I want to take a look at is multicultural theory and multicultural education. And it really takes me back to where hopefully I feel like I started from. In our egalitarian system, we're trying to create equal educational opportunities for all students. And maybe the way we have been teaching, and the way our system was set up, it's not meeting all students' needs. And so we need to take a look at it in a more diverse cultures and diverse groups, and to affirm persons with their multiple identities. And most students don't have one identity. They have multiple identities. You can have your race identity, you can have your ethnic identity in there, your identity based on your family structure, your identity based on your education, your identity based on your sexual preference. We are made up of multiple identities. And so we can't just make assumptions about persons. Oh, I see this person looks like that, so this must be who they are. We all have multiple identities, and we have to allow students the space to explore their multiple identities and feel comfortable with those multiple identities. The inclusive definition of diversity would include all these areas, including disability. And I want to talk a little bit more about disability. The disability studies, the disability theories were all based on what went on in the United States during the Civil Rights era. That legislation was developed based on civil rights information, and it became more of a necessity, Vietnam War, because more people were coming home with various disabilities. And I think this is another area that there's very good theory that can inform our practice, and I think this is another area that we're going to see that there's a lot more students coming through the system with disabilities given the current war that we're in. In multicultural education, when we started talking about diversity and multiculturalism in schools and in the communities, we talked about celebrations, sharing food, sharing at a celebratory level. And really, that's not enough. That's a good place to start, but we're moving down the continuum now. And when we talk about multicultural education, it really needs to be integrated in the content there by the ethnomathematics, and I have a number of ideas in the ethno-math area with a large group of people in the United States working on that. But also the cultural content and all the other disciplines. As I was preparing for this, I was reminded again that there is an ethno-science group out there, and there is a lot of multicultural science education going on. All our silos of our disciplines in education started from a cultural base. People decided they needed to share information and to develop intellectually, and in that process the disciplines were established, but they were all rooted in cultural needs in various parts of the world, and it certainly can guide our thinking and can then acknowledge those identities of persons who are sitting in our classroom, that it just wasn't the Europeans who thought this was a good idea. Knowledge construction of how we take a look at putting information together. We certainly have a lot to learn from Native Americans and their holistic view of science and of mathematics and of the world, much more environmentally sound than where we're trying to get ourselves to. But each culture has a little different way of approaching, whether going from the particular to the more general or from the more general to the more particular. Each culture has a way of going about that and taking a look at how that affirms people in the classroom is very important. Equity of pedagogy, that we have multiple ways of doing things and that it's just not this one approach that's going to work for everybody. And also that we have, and it's not on here but it will come later, an assessment, using multiple approaches to assess whether students are learning. I've done the regular standardized test to prepare people for a regular college mathematics course, and some students get an A on it and some don't do so well, and then I give them a project on the same material to do. And some of the students who get a C or a D on that more algorithmic test with some word problems on it put a project together that is absolutely beautiful. They understand linear equations. They've applied it to some aspect of their life. They've made arguments for it. They've put a wonderful piece together. And there are other people who've gotten A's on the test in their project. I'm thinking, do they know, if it hit them, would they know how to use it? They've got the academic knowledge, but they don't know how to apply it to any part in their life. And we often give more value to this academic knowledge, and I think we need to put ourselves over and maybe err in the direction of useful knowledge. And that will, and if you can use the knowledge in your daily life, you're more apt to get stronger at some of those skills that you're having a hard time holding on to. And an empowering school culture, so students feel like they belong on the campus and in that classroom, and that they have a voice in that classroom. As an introduction to disability, it looks like many people in the room probably remember when they were putting curb cuts and redoing cities. And I know the conversation at the time was, we're wasting this good money tearing up sidewalks and things, making public buildings with ramps for a few persons with disabilities who might even come and take use of the service. Who uses these curb cuts now? Most of us, and we have found it very, very helpful. If you're riding a bike, you just absolutely love it. Yeah. If you've got a stroller, you'll love it. If you're got your little bag with wheels, you're loving it. I mean, we all use it. So we made an accommodation for disabilities, and it has become useful for everyone. And that's the kind of picture I want you to have in your mind when you think about disability theory. And that's basically what disability theory has done to education, is it's stopped thinking about making accommodations for a student who doesn't have use of their arms, or who is blind, or is in a wheelchair, and start thinking about, how can I make this classroom accessible to everyone? And in the process, instead of needing to make accommodations, you have a range of activities going on in the classroom that reaches everyone. And there are other students in your class that may not be visual. There are other ones that may be visual. Some students are tactile, some are not. So when you, instead of making individual accommodations, what you're doing is you're taking a look at the range of people that could be in the classroom and designing your course materials so they can fit everyone. And in the process, you'll find that there's something in there that helps everyone, just as the curb cuts have helped. This is actually from a publication that's not quite out yet, so I won't give you a copy of this one. I was editing for the journal, for the Learning Assistance Review, and this was just put in from a workshop that I participated in the summer. And this first part here is universal design that was used for architecture, and what the law and the focus was to make sure that there was equitable use, flexibility in use, that it was easy to use, the signs in the elevators and things to make it easy. And then how that fits into instruction, and these instructional design things have been out for quite a while now. And this is kind of just translating universal design and architecture to the classroom. And the new thing that we worked on this summer then is also taking a look at what would it mean to learning support services. What would universal universal design, what would it look like for instructional, for learning support services? And again, it's good to take a look at and reflect on how then can this translate to my practice in the classroom, because that's what we need to be about. I spoke a little bit of approaches to diversity, multicultural education in the United States, and you see celebration is quite high on the list as we go up, but I think now this is where we need to be and where our hard work is in the disciplines, in our support services, in administration, to do more critical reflection on what we're doing, who is successful, and how we can be more supportive of people succeeding in our services. And then our transformation in our use of words, our approaches to education. One of the things, and I was going to hit it later, but I think I'll hit it right now because I think it's very important. To get to that critical reflection and transformation, I think part of what you need is a very, very stable faculty, staff, and administration to get there, because it takes a lot of hard work. That's what we've really had at the General College, and that's been very, very helpful to us. But one of the major problems I find in developmental education is that most faculty are part-time or are adjunct faculty, and I don't know what the situation is here. And I know that was one of the things when I accepted the job at Eastern Michigan. One of the things that attracted me when I went there in 1990 is they had made an institutional commitment that all their developmental faculty would be full-time faculty. They would not use part-time faculty. If they didn't have enough full-time faculty, they would not offer the course. And they stuck to it. And that was absolutely wonderful. Because when the administration makes a commitment to faculty, makes a commitment to your student support personnel, that really helps you. It sends a message to the students of how important your work with them is. And it also then gives you that time and space to do critical reflection and to meet with one another and to get out of disciplinary silos into cross-communication, to do more professional development kind of activities. And so that's a very, very, very important step, and actually that's what we have also in at the University of Minnesota, all full-time faculty. And that's a wonderful step to be able to get to this point. And then we also then were able, certainly not at the University of Minnesota, because the University of Minnesota has a low teaching load anyhow across the university because their focus is research. But at Eastern, the developmental faculty actually taught less credit hours than the full-time faculty did, because they needed the more time to work with the students and to do more bridging between the student support services, the tutoring, and we also did some advising. And so that was another very, very important part. A social cultural theory, Gotsky, Bandura, and Leif have all really forwarded information that's very, very important in developmental education. And this gets me back to the whole cultural kind of thing, that student development or development of us as humans happens through social interaction. So I'm doing a miserable job of this today, but I'm going to be done quickly. And that it's mediated by abstract symbols or tools, and that's how our writing came into being, our books, our mathematics came into being, tools to help us interact socially better and to leave notes for one another, and now our computers and all the rest of the technology. But it came out of a social interaction and need to communicate with one another. And so it is culturally based and looks different in different parts of the world. And these tools weren't created in isolation. They were created through social interaction with people working together and trying to figure out what can we do to make this easier or better. And so that takes us to this last stage here, where cultural development can only be achieved if we end up then concentrating on what are the processes that we need to allow us to communicate better, for us to become a more global world. What are those processes that will get us there? We really can't train students in all they need to know to be productive for the next 20, 30, 40 years, because things will change. But we can provide them with some of the tools of how do we approach problems, how do we resolve problems, how do we use the tools we have to create new tools to be able to solve our problems working as a society and a culture. And in the classroom, the way it would translate, we certainly need to start out, and this is the kind of approach that I use in my classroom, some kind of physical event activity, some common thing that we experience together. And sometimes, if you don't want to create the activity within the classroom, you at least start it with what person's information, what they're bringing into the classroom, where they are, their personal information on the topic that you're dealing with. And then their representation of it. In math, pictorial stuff works absolutely wonderful. Certainly, this is a place where even the mapping of ideas can take place, of how things interrelate, how are you seeing things, concepts, ideas interrelating. And then students using their own language. And in the academy, we usually want to give them our language so quickly that we never get to understand how it's being translated in their head with their words. And for the few of you that teach math in here, I mean, when I talk about a straight line, I'm talking a line with a constant slope. And for many students, a straight line is basically just a horizontal line, and that's it. And when I move from that horizontal line, they think this is not a straight line. That's a kind of crooked line. This is the straight line here. And unless I know who's thinking that way in the classroom, my words in creating one idea, and I'm sure I've communicated it absolutely correctly, I've used good mathematical language to talk about a straight line. But as long as that student's intuitive language and what they're going in their head, oh yeah, straight line, it's like that. Yeah. We're not communicating. And so I think the hardest job we have as educators is to understand students' language. How are they interpreting what is being said? And we don't spend enough time there. And that's what I have tried to do more of in group activities and walking around the classroom or getting students to participate, to understand what is the language they're using to understand what is being said, which I haven't done at all here today yet. but I won't do. And then I can bridge that with the structured language, the language of the academy. But I can't bridge it with the language of the academy unless I know what the language is. Another cute little story in mathematics, because I know many mathematics stories. I had went to a presentation on using sign language in the class in mathematics, and there's some problems with sign language, but the obvious one for me is the sign language for the distributive property, which you can distribute multiplication to addition, subtraction within your parentheses. The basic language, the sign is something like this. And that's the same sign, and a woman had used it, and the class of non-hearing students started laughing, couldn't figure out what the deal was. Well, that's the same sign that is used for loose woman who distributes. And so, again, it's knowing the mathematical language and what also those words are also used for. And that's not the only term. That's the one that sticks in my head because it was kind of funny. But a lot of our mathematical language also has different language or has different meanings in other disciplines. And unless you unpack that with students, you don't know if you're communicating. You think you are. You're using very good language, but it's not saying the same thing as you think you are. And then in math, of course, we go to symbolic representation, but here this is where you would abstract, you would go one step further to how does this apply in other situations in the world. We started out with a particular situation, we understood that situation, and then where does that take us? What else can we infer from this? How can we make this idea grow? And this is my last couple of slides here. The necessary components for effective developmental education programs, I think, are in these next 13 things that I've listed here. Institutional commitment, and I was delighted to see, even by the elevator, your goal, mission, and on the website, it very clearly states that developmental education is honored in this institution. And that's one of my sad parts. Because the General College was closed in July, and our institution is basically saying, no, we don't value developmental education. We're finding ways and advocating for ways to get that value back again, but I think it's waning at our institution, and a lot of work needs to be done with that. But I see your institution does have a commitment. And maybe there's some other ways it can be strengthened. And first, getting it in the mission stated in the fabric of the institution is the first place to start. But more of this professional development and opportunities is a way to grow it. And I know when I started teaching developmental education in the 80s, when people said, what you really need to do is you need to do more professional development. You need to go to conferences. You need to go to professional meetings and things. And I thought, I don't have time to do that. I've got too many papers to grade. I'm preparing for this new class that I'm teaching. But it is the most mind-opening thing that you can do. And it's wonderful doing it in your discipline to strengthen your ideas and your disciplinary teaching information, but places like MAID and places in multicultural education or disability education where you have people from across disciplines is very exciting because you can always get information from other disciplines to think about your discipline in new and creative ways. And you can't do that if you're stuck on taking care of your classroom all the time. And having some flexibility to do that is also a wonderful institutional commitment. Regular and systematic evaluations, and most institutions do a wonderful evaluation of their goals. How many graduates do I have? How many students came out of this class? How many students got A's and B's? And they're taking care of their needs in the evaluation of what they deem as success. But the other part of that really is taking a look at what are the students there for? What do the students deem as success? When I did my dissertation as a qualitative research thing and talked to students 3 years after they finished their developmental education and asking them questions, what was the most important thing for you going through that process? And most of them mentioned increased self-esteem, finding somebody in the education system that really cared about them as a person and helped them move forward. I mean, they learned the skills, but that wasn't the thing that they're carrying with them forward. It's more of these student development things that we had talked about. And those are the important things that people will carry forward with them and will carry with them with their children, their families, and will move us forward on this planet. The coordination of services is very, very, very important, and some people are able to achieve that by having a comprehensive college or one department that houses everything. The research really has shown it doesn't really matter if it's centralized or not centralized. What it matters is that it is coordinated and that the people that make up that system are working hard together to make whatever that system is work. At Eastern, we didn't have a centralized system, but it was because I was in the math department. I had very personal relationships with the math that were getting our students when we were done, and before I left, and it continues today. The math professors actually preferred our developmental math students to a student who got into the classroom based on their ACT score because they knew what they knew. And they knew they had a solid foundation, they knew they had study skills, they knew that they were ready to get moving. And the other group was just all over the board. And sometimes when you're in your disciplinary thing, you're able to make sure that there's those smooth connections. And so that's the other reason I was glad when Linda mentioned that there are some people that are just beyond developmental, because that's the other area that there needs to be increased communication and ideas with. There needs to be the integration of services. Part of the thing, many of the things that have been tried with tutoring centers, having tutors come into the classroom when you're doing group activities, have a little period of time where people are actually, the tutors are in the classroom working with the faculty, so that when a student walks into the tutoring center, they know somebody, and they're more apt to follow them there because they've seen them in the classroom and already know who they are. Same thing with, we have classes where counselors are part of the class in learning communities and in breakout sessions. And again, that helps students then be able to keep and forge those connections. So integration of services is also very important. As I mentioned, frequent and multiple kind of assessments are important. The alignment of courses. And this alignment needs to happen not just so that your students just kind of squeak in the door and have another year of struggling behind them. Our goal at Eastern was always that when our students came out of class, they were going to be the A and B students in the next class they went to. And for the most part, it did work. They did well. And that's why the math faculty then was so supportive of the developmental program. And so we have to make sure we set our standards high enough that we're not making it easy for students so that they can get through, and then they're still at the bottom of the class when they get to the next rung. We want to get them to the point so that they can now envision themselves, see themselves, and be in the top half of the class and feel wonderful about that. Mandatory counseling and assessment and placement, and I think you may have some of that here. We didn't have that at Eastern. We implemented it and it worked a lot better. We don't have that at the University of Minnesota, and it really is a weakness. Students don't often know where they need to start, and unless we do mandatory assessment, but then they can do what they want to do. And from this last study that I did, more of our second generation students, white students, will take the placement test and say, well, I don't need to, I can do this, and they'll move off and fail a couple times. And many of our more first-generation students, minority students, urban students will listen wholeheartedly to the information they get, and will start out in the lower level classes and are getting more success because of doing that. But also that, to me, is doing some tiering stuff that we don't want to be doing. Avoid reliance on part-time adjunct faculty and staff. Again, institutions that have done that have had much greater success in implementing all these guidelines. And then minding the gap between secondary and post-secondary education. And I know I shared the one last conference that we had with our K-12 system and with post-secondary education, again, bringing the disciplines, counselors, and people together, working together to mind that gap, because there is a gap between those two. And I think as developmental educators, we need to be very up on, I mean, we've got the most information of what those gaps are, and we need to work then to deal with that. And this is just showing the large percentage of students in the educational system taking remedial courses in the United States. And this was from 2000. And it's gotten a little higher since then. So I would love to have a discussion with you. Did I have this one? Yeah. Where are we on the continuum? And I think this is the discussion that we need to have, you need to have, where we need to go. I've shared with you my words, and it's going to take your reflection on whether or not you embrace any of that and where you want to go forward with that. Yes?
Let's delve right into a big subject right now.
Okay.
The point about adjunct instructors versus full-time instructors, because we have many adjunct instructors in our developmental education. What I'm going to ask, what's the goal or outcome around it? What is the concern when you rely largely on adjunct instructors as opposed to full-time?
They usually don't get as many benefits for professional development. You're not making a commitment to them, so there's some adjunct faculty who do make a wonderful commitment to the institution, but it's not reciprocated. They're less apt to spend more time on campus talking again to that next rung of faculty that they're going into, unless they're teaching in the developmental and beyond the developmental. They would have less contact with counseling staff, tutoring staff. They're less of a part of the developmental community on campus, and there usually is more turnover in adjunct than there is in full faculty, because they are adjunct. If a full-time position came up, they probably would take one. And so that minimizes how you can build your theory, build your ideas, and put a cohesive program together. There are ways around it, but that's the major.
And that was kind of the point of my question.
Yeah.
I mean, if you know what your concerns are, then you start thinking about systems to speak to those concerns.
Right. Yes.
I've got a question about range of student skills. If right now, I see one of the problems that we have, we put all of our AFP students basically in a class, because it's only a 15-week class. We only have several. It seems to me that there needs to be a wider range of, maybe even starting with some kind of type of an open lab or something, even to get ready for the class. So just curious what people are doing around the country, and that to deal with rather than just put them in a 15-week class, or are people doing something broader range, or what's
Oh, there's some wonderful things that are being done around the country. The one that comes to mind is in Palo Alto College. One of the things that they're doing, because they were having difficulty with these 15-week semesters and often ending up with students who they discover after the second week, oh my God, we could have put them up in a different class, or oh, we need to get them down in a different class. They have almost their 15 weeks semester cut up into 4 pieces. So if you start out, there's another class that starts after like the 4th week, where you could, and it meets more times a week, so you can actually get in. So if you were placed in a pre-algebra class and you really belong in an algebra class, there's a real quick time for you to get out, get into that algebra class that happens to starting that 4th week of class, and has then a longer time for the rest of the semester. So they have classes that start after like the 4th or 5th week. They also have ones that start in the middle, so that if you finish all your coursework the first half, you can move on for the second half, or they can spend time with you for that second half. So that's one kind of thing, breaking up your semester, having times where people can move, and the key to that is making sure your classes are offered at the same time, so that it's easy for me to move from one class to another without having to mess up my job schedule or my childcare schedule or whatever. And I didn't mention that. That's the other thing, part of the services, is if you have the full range of services so a student can be on campus.
But I guess the other part of that is the whole thing of time on test. Seems like a course, typical course is not long enough for some students. What are they doing about that? Do they have labs to support those courses?
Labs to support the courses. Again, having tutors come into the classroom to support the interaction within the classroom. And the other thing is as students move on to the next semester, SI courses adjacent to it to support those areas where they're still weak, so that they can keep on moving, but we're not holding them back. That's one of the things that I'm particularly struggling with right now, is we're taking some of our students that we've placed most at risk, and we're giving them a year or a half a year or a year and a half of extra classes to take to get to where they need to be. And is that helpful, or do we need to try a different approach? And that's why this thing that I'm doing with geology next semester is I'm taking students who have had 2 or 3 years of high school math, and I'm putting them through an intensive, and I'm not teaching it as a math class, I'm teaching it as a freshman seminar, putting them through an intensive math, following their content area, because that's where people need to use the mathematics in a content area if they're not going on. And I'm taking one of our lab physical science classes to follow them with their mathematics in that course.
Give us some statistics about how many people require developmental mathematics and other classes. So what is developmental mathematics? What level of mathematics classes are you talking about?
It depends on what institution you're at. Harvard, anything below calculus is developmental math. Yeah.
You just had that previous slide.
Oh, in this previous slide? And I think that's defined by the institution. But most generally around the nation, developmental mathematics is anything below college algebra, but I don't know if on this particular survey that's the mark. I think they let the institutions define what that is.
A follow-up of that is, in your opinion, what is developmental math?
Right now?
Sure.
Right now, I think anything below intermediate algebra, because I think many of the topics that we cover particularly at universities, Eastern, and I'm not sure what your topics are that you cover in intermediate algebra here, but most of our intermediate topics are still what most university courses now are teaching in college algebra. They're going into a little bit more in depth in them, but they're the same topics. We deal with in intermediate all the way up through systems of equations, quadratic equations, but we don't deal with, well, we could talk about this in the math thing, but many of the topics that are covered in college algebra are covered on a more rudimentary level in intermediate algebra, and for most part students are memorizing them for the test, and when they get to college algebra they still are struggling, it would be better to get them into the college algebra with an SI or some kind of support from a developmental educator and get them through the college algebra if that's what they're heading to do, and save them a semester, I think. And what I've heard from calculus instructors is students don't know fractions. And they don't, again, that would happen great through SI, because when they get there and need to use it, they're going to go review it, because we live in a pretty decimal world today. We don't do much. If we went to the metric system, we'd be practically done with fractions. Yes?
What's SI?
Supplemental instruction. So that you have a 3-credit, 4-credit hour class, and then they also register for like a 1 or 2-credit hour class along with it. And that's in smaller groups, and it really just goes over all the material that was covered in class. It's like a study group. Most of the time, SI instructors have to, yes, it would be required for students. And most SIs, they do pay for the credit. Our TRIO program pays for the credit for students to take the SI. And through the supplemental instruction, we have it with all our content areas, including writing and reading and biology. The SI attached to it. And the SI leader actually attends class, so they know, they take notes, they compare their notes with the students' notes. And then instead of being in a class of 60 or 40, they're in a small group of 5 or 6. Yes?
I was just going to mention, though, in some institutions, SI operates just a little bit differently, where the SI section is not content-based, it's strategy-based. And so the person who runs the SI session is helping students develop some tools for understanding the content rather than going over the content more. And then the students, sometimes students don't have to go to SI unless their score falls below a certain level on their tests, and then they're sent to SI until they can bring their grades up. So there are lots of SI models out there.
Thank you.
Do they pay for that then if they don't have to go or not?
Generally, it depends on the institution whether they offer SI simply through their learning support services. Many colleges do require that 1 credit hour extra, and they pay for it.
They get credit for it?
Yeah, but it would be like elective credit rather than anything else, so they're going to end up with plenty of elective credit. The advantage that they have often found with students actually paying for the credit, they take it a bit more seriously than if it was just given. Then it'd be like going to tutoring, and you might go, you might not go. But if they paid for it, there may be a little bit more follow through on it. Yes.
2 of your pieces of research interest me, and I'll tell you the 2, and maybe you could just respond to one that I'm curious to find out what you found out or studied in the affective factors affecting mathematics outcomes, and then if there's something you could share with us on that, and then how ethno-mathematics research can inform developmental math. What is ethno-mathematics, and how does that work in the classroom?
Well, I could kind of speak to both of them because they are interrelated. The ethnomath has really taken a cultural base to the mathematics. And it can start out with from the students' own culture. I sometimes have like students talk to, and we have a large immigrant community in Minnesota now, which we never did before. Well, since I've been there, we've had it. So we have a large Hmong population, I think one of the largest Hmong populations in the United States. We have a large Eastern African population. And most of our Eastern African students and our Hmong students grew up in, or parents grew up, or they grew up in refugee camps and were waiting to come to the United States and have then come to the United States, either their generation or the generation before. And then we have a large Mexican Latino population and our black population that lives in the city. And particularly for immigrant, but it really does work for everybody. I have them interview somebody that they know is really, really good in doing mental math and to talk to them about how they do it. And it's really an absolutely wonderful way for me to review order of operations because people are doing that community property and all different things in their head because they know it works. And when I put the language on it, then I'm again just translating from their intuitive family cultural information to the mathematical knowledge. When I just present it as mathematical rules, it's got a whole different thing to it. I know in India, the system that they used 2,000 years ago for multiplication is the same as the FOIL system that we use in mathematics today. And they use it for multiplication of regular numbers, not of algebraic expressions. And introducing that in the class, the students go, well, gee, 2,000 years ago they used that, and they see how it works with regular numbers, and it does work, and it's really ordering and counting things by their place value. Then they have a better understanding of why are we doing this in algebra. And then it's not memorizing a rule or an acronym, but it's understanding more of the math behind it. The Egyptian system and the old Russian system, we also do have a lot of Russians coming over. Those systems are very, very similar. The peasant Russian system and the Egyptian system of multiplying using doubling and halving. And it's a wonderful way to review powers and scientific notation. And you're putting it in a cultural context that affirms one's cultural roots and also helps you move forward teaching some of our academic mathematics. Many ethnomathematicians are also doing research working with tribal students or with students in Alaska, Inuit, and again starting with first grade, moving on up, but taking a look at things that they do in their culture that use mathematics, whether it's weaving, artwork, in part of their farming, whatever it is, and then moving it forward, then bringing it into the classroom and developing the mathematical concepts from those concepts that a student already knows. And so it's affirming the student, and probably that's the most difficult part, I think, in developmental mathematics, is students often don't feel like they belong. They want to, but they don't, and we don't affirm all the strengths and skills that they do have. I think many of my students in mathematics have wonderful mathematical skills. I mean, they know how long it's going to take them to get from here to the next place. They can figure out the time with great accuracy if they're taking 3 buses, how to get in whatever. But as soon as they walk in the classroom door, they think that doesn't have any math in it. But if you bring that into the math classroom and talk about all the mathematical skills that you do have and how that relates to academic mathematics, all the writing, speaking, language skills, history skills that you have outside of that door, bring that into the classroom and affirm that wonderful information and the skills that they have, and then help them move those skills forward, that's what helps developmental students, I think. And so more time needs to be spent at understanding what the student is bringing into the classroom and affirming what they have in the classroom. What are their study skills? What is working for them? What knowledge they do have. They have a lot more knowledge in the street, in their culture, in their world, than they have the academic knowledge. We got to make those bridges to the academic knowledge. And they haven't seen those bridges is the part, in my mind, that's missing. What are the bridges? Yes?
Just returned from a trip to the Baltimore area. We were talking to 3 institutions there. And one of the things we're talking about is developmental education. They, by the way, say they have somewhere between 67 and 69% of their students taking at least one developmental class.
Yeah.
And mathematics is the most common need for developmental. I'm interested in your comments around centralized and decentralized, because that was one of the conversations I had in 2 out of 3 institutions. I'm not sure about the third, have a decentralized system. And I asked, I said, what's the secret here? And the answer was a very simple one: talk to each other. Fundamentally, it's what we've done. So I'm kind of interested in your thoughts around that in terms of how you accomplish that. When you're working with the decentralized system, which we have vigorously supported here, how do you accomplish that, to get that coordination?
Well, that's where this professional development, setting times apart, and whether that is, through scheduling, making sure, and I would not suggest on Friday mornings, but picking a time that on a regular basis, those disciplines and student support staff can get together and have quality time together. That was the beauty that we had in the general college. They've taken all our counselors out of our department now and stuck them someplace else. And just the physical removal of them and the lineup, it's been very, very difficult to maintain relationships that people have had for tens of years. So you really have to work at it more. So you need to carve time out to make sure that there is a time where people are not scheduled to be every place else, but have some time set aside to meet as a group and to carry on professional development activities. Certainly through you having events in a discipline base and inviting counselors having things and inviting disciplinary-based folks into their activities, that also does help. And then there needs to be strong coordination between the administrators so that the administrators are valuing the activity. Because if there's any sense that the administrators aren't valuing it, well, if you have time, go, but if you don't, you really don't need to do that. That's not going to help the system either. The earliest studies in developmental education that Boyle and Hunter did basically did say they need to be centralized systems. And after they looked at the range of developmental programs throughout the country, they realized it doesn't have to be centralized, but faculty and staff and administrators need to work closely together. There are some advantages to being discipline-based, and I know from my experience at Eastern what some of those advantages were. Yes.
Just a comment in defense of adjunct faculty.
Okay.
I think you have...
I think they're wonderful.
Well, yes.
But I think they deserve more respect.
Oh, I feel
Okay.
like I get plenty of respect here. I truly do.
Okay.
That's not my concern. But one thing I think that is very positive about adjunct is that I feel because I work part-time, I have the time for professional development and writer's workshop that I'm involved in right now. If I worked full-time, I would not.
Okay.
I would be overloaded. And that helps me be better in the classroom.
Great.
Question. A student who takes developmental ed courses is a developmental student, or is there any other intrinsic characteristic of the person that makes the person a developmental ed student?
Well, I would even move to say it's a student who takes developmental education rather than making it a developmental student. I mean, we're all in a development process. And putting the label on the service rather than on the student is first of all what I would do. But certainly if we looked at Chickering and Perry and student development, there are students that are in a developmental stage just personally that may not be need developmental classes, but do need the additional supports because they're a first-generation student and they really don't have the knowledge of how to work through a system of higher education, because that's not family knowledge that was shared. They don't know how to maneuver either at the community college or at the university level. Those students need supports. They may not need the classwork supports, but they need the other supports to be able to feel. Many commuter students often need additional supports to feel like they're part of the campus, and you have to really do a lot of extra kind of things to make commuter students feel like they're part of the community. And they may not need developmental services, developmental coursework, but they need some development as a student to be able to fit into the system and to maneuver better into the system. So can we take one more question then? Or
Okay,
no?
we'll take one more, and then you'll have a chance to talk during lunch or in your circle.
Very quick final
Okay.
question, because I know we're over time. But does your college have any kind of freshman seminar or adjustment to college for all students?
It's an elective, and through counseling, most of our students are encouraged to take a personal development course or introduction to the university kind of course. In general, the university across has freshman seminars and encourages all students to take freshman seminars. And that's the one point I forgot to mention that I think is very important. What we know as developmental educators is not just good for developmental students. It's good for all students. And part of what the university has been telling us of why they've moved us is because they want us to share our wealth of information across the university to all first-year classes. If it's good for developmental education, it's good for all students. It's good education, taking a holistic look at students. And if they're true to that and not just trying to make us feel better, then we can have a real impact across the university. And that's another area to really look at administratively. What are you doing with your wealth of information for students who are not in developmental coursework that really can infuse into across the disciplines dealing with the whole student?
It's like the handicap.
Yes, it's like the curb thing, yes.
Okay, I am, what else let me get out here? I want to thank
Thank you
Dr.
so much.
Duranzik very much.